Hey, what's up everyone? Tonight we're stepping back into the 1800s. A time when soap wasn't something you bought from a store in a neat paper wrapper. It was something you built with your own hands, with ashes and fat, with patience and danger. This is the long story of how soap was made in the 1800s. Let's begin with part 1. The barrel leaned against the side of the farmhouse, half rotten from years of rain and sun. Its staves were swollen with damp, and a dark stain ran from the hole cut near its base. Beneath it, the earth had gone black where liquid had dripped for seasons, etching the soil like acid. Everyone in the house knew not to touch it with bare hands. That barrel was no ordinary vessel. It was the heart of soap making, the strange alchemy that kept families clean when the world around them was dirt, sweat, and labor. In the morning, Mary came out carrying a bucket filled with gray ash. She'd swept it carefully from the fireplace, choosing only the pale powder left after the hardwood burned slow and hot through the night. She dumped it into the barrel, the soft dust rising like smoke, stinging her nose. Then she pressed it down with a stick, packing the ash tighter, the way her mother had taught her. Ash makes the lye, her mother always said. And the lye makes the soap. Without it, the clothes will never come clean. From the kitchen door, little Samuel watched. He had been warned never to go near the dripping hole at the bottom of the barrel. He had heard stories of what the brown liquid could do, how it could eat through a feather in minutes, how a drop could burn a hole in a hand. Once, an old neighbor had spilled some across her leg, and the scar was still there, white and ridged as a rope. Mary poured water over the ashes, slow and careful. It trickled down, soaking the gray dust, sinking deeper. And then, from the hole, the first drops began to fall into the waiting crock below, a dark, bitter stream that smelled faintly of smoke and metal. This was lye, though no one in the family called it by its chemical name. To them, it was simply the water from the ash, the dangerous broth that turned grease into something useful. Inside the house, another preparation was happening. A pot simmered on the hearth, filled not with stew but with fat, pale, greasy clumps melting down into a golden slick. This too was part of the ritual. After every butchering, nothing was wasted. The flesh became meals, the bones became stock, and the fat, every scrap of it, was rendered into tallow. The smell was heavy, clinging to clothes and hair, but to the people of the house, it meant cleanliness in the months to come. By midday, the yard was alive with work. The iron kettle was rolled out, its sides black with old soot. It was set upon stones, a fire kindled beneath. The lye water was carried carefully, sloshing in buckets, and poured into the pot. Then came the fat, ladled in with slow, steady hands. When the two met, the mixture hissed, a strange foam rising on the surface. The stirring began. A paddle, taller than a man, was thrust into the pot, and with long, steady strokes the mixture was churned. The sound was thick and wet, the smell acrid, smoke, fat, and something biting that caught in the throat. Hours passed, the paddle never still. Children were sent to fetch wood for the fire. The men carried more buckets of lye. The women took turns stirring, their arms aching, sweat running down their faces. And slowly, as the sun slipped westward, the change began. The liquid grew heavy, its surface glossy. The smell deepened, not just fat, not just ash, but something new, something sharp and clean. Foam clung to the paddle, clung to the rim of the kettle. This was the moment of magic, the moment when grease and ash water surrendered themselves and became soap. It was not pretty. It was not white, or perfumed, or cut into neat bars. It was brownish, soft, more paste than solid. But it was soap. Scooped into crocks, it would be carried inside and stored. Through the winter, it would scrub laundry in steaming tubs, scour floors blackened with dirt, wash hands stained with soil and blood. It would sting sometimes, crack skin, but it would clean. As dusk fell, the family gathered, weary from the day's work. The kettle was scraped, the last of the soap spooned out. The ashes in the barrel still dripped their dark stream, ready for the next boiling. And Mary, standing in the yard with smoke in her hair, thought of her mother, and her mother's mother, all of them bent over kettles, all of them stirring, all of them keeping alive the strange and dangerous craft that turned waste into survival. Soap was not luxury. Soap was not beauty. Soap was labor, fire, and risk. Soap was life. The kettle groaned as the fire roared beneath it. The iron was old, blackened with years of heat, but it still held steady against the flames. Inside, the mixture bubbled and spat, a restless swirl of fat and lye. The smell drifted across the yard, sharp, bitter, almost metallic, so strong that neighbors walking past wrinkled their noses. Yet to the family bent over the pot, it was the scent of necessity. Mary's husband, Thomas, leaned on the long paddle, his hands wrapped in rags. The paddle shaft was slick from years of stirring, its wood darkened by smoke and steam. With each turn, the heavy mixture resisted, clinging like mud. He pushed harder, his arms trembling, sweat cutting lines through the soot on his face. Beside him, old Mrs. Whitfield, who had come from the neighboring farm to help, muttered instructions in her cracked voice. "Slow now. Don't rush it. The soap has its own pace. If you push too hard, it'll break apart." She had seen more kettles of soap than she could count, and her word carried weight. The children sat on the fence, eyes wide, watching the strange labor. To them, the bubbling pot was almost alive, growling and sighing as if it breathed. Every hiss and spit of lye against iron sent them jerking back, their imaginations filled with fire and danger. Samuel whispered to his sister that it looked like a witch's brew, the kind he'd overheard in stories told by candlelight. Hours stretched. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Still, the kettle boiled, the paddle moved. Soap making was never quick, it demanded patience, demanded endurance. A misstep could ruin the batch, wasting weeks of saved fat and ash. So they stirred, and they waited, and they watched the mixture thicken, slowly surrendering itself to transformation. From time to time, Thomas lifted the paddle, letting the thick liquid drip back into the pot. Each strand clung longer, stretched heavier. That was the sign they were nearing the end. Still, he dared not stop. The fire needed feeding, the paddle needed motion. Around them, the days slipped by in the rhythm of labor: fetch wood, stir, carry lye, stir again. At last, as shadows stretched across the yard, the change came. The surface of the mixture lost its oily sheen, turning duller, thicker, almost like porridge. A smell rose with it, not pleasant, not sweet, but unmistakably clean, a sharpness that cut through the air. The family exchanged glances, their fatigue lifted by the knowledge that the work was paying off. Mary stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron, and peered into the pot. "It's ready," she whispered, though her voice carried enough strength for all to hear. Even Mrs. Whitfield nodded, her wrinkled mouth turning into a thin smile. The fire was banked, the pot carefully shifted. The soap, thick, heavy, steaming, was ladled into waiting crocks. Each scoop landed with a wet slap, filling the earthen vessels one by one. Steam rose, carrying with it the raw scent of ash and fat. It clung to their clothes, to their hair, but no one complained. For them, these crocks meant survival. Each jar of soap would last through the winter, scrubbing filth from clothes beaten against washboards, washing dirt from hands after long days in the fields, scouring wooden floors stained with mud. This soap would keep sickness at bay, keep the household from drowning in grime. It was more valuable than silver. As night fell, the yard grew quiet. The crocks cooled, the kettle sat empty, its black sides still hot from the fire. The barrel of ash still dripped, slow and steady, feeding the earth below. The children were sent to bed, their hair smelling of smoke, their dreams filled with bubbling cauldrons and strange alchemy. In the silence, Mary stood alone beside the crocks. She touched the surface of the cooling soap, her fingers hovering just above it. She thought of her mother, long gone, who had once stood in the same place, watching her own batches cool in the evening air. She thought of her daughter, sleeping inside, who one day would take her place. Soap was never just soap. It was memory, tradition, and survival woven together. It was the story of generations, carried in barrels of ash, in fat rendered from animals they had raised and butchered, in kettles blackened by years of fire. And as the stars blinked to life above the farmhouse, the crocks of soap gleamed faintly in the moonlight, like treasure earned not with gold, but with labor and patience. The first chill of autumn swept across the valley, crisp and sharp, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke. In the farmhouse yard, the crocks of soap from the last boiling sat lined against the wall, their surfaces hardened into dull, brown paste. They were waiting, as they always did, for the season's great labor, laundry day. At dawn, the women rose before the men, before the rooster crowed. The yard filled with the groan of wooden tubs being dragged from the shed, the clank of iron pots placed over fresh fires. Buckets were carried from the well, splashing icy water on the dirt path, each trip leaving wet footprints in the dust. The work was endless, but it was ritual, and rituals gave life order. Mary tied her hair in a rag and set her shoulders. Before her, the largest tub stood ready, its sides worn smooth from years of scrubbing. She took a scoop from the crock, her fingers sinking into the soft soap. It clung stubbornly, sticky and heavy, and when she dropped it into the steaming pot, it dissolved into a froth that filled the air with its biting scent. The first shirts went in, men's shirts stiff with sweat, children's smocks blackened at the hem, aprons stained with grease. They sank beneath the surface, steam curling from the pot like ghosts. Mary's paddle churned them, her hands red from the heat, her arms already aching. But the soap bit into the cloth, stripping away dirt, releasing the filth of days. Around her, the others worked in rhythm. Sarah, the neighbor's daughter, slapped clothes against a washboard, each strike echoing like a drum. Old Mrs. Whitfield hunched over a smaller tub, her gnarled hands surprisingly steady as she scrubbed linens white. Children darted back and forth, carrying buckets of rinse water, their laughter cutting through the heavy air. It was more than washing, it was battle. Battle against dirt, against disease, against the slow rot of unwashed cloth. The soap, harsh as it was, became their weapon. Its sting on their skin meant it was working, meant it was burning away what clung and corrupted. By midday, the yard was alive with color. Lines stretched between posts, sagging under the weight of dripping clothes. Shirts flapped like flags in the breeze, sheets billowed like sails. The smell of lye and wet cloth hung thick, but beneath it was something fresher, cleaner, almost sweet in its own way. Thomas passed through, pausing to watch. His hands were scarred from years of chopping wood, his face burned by sun and wind. He smiled faintly at the sight of his children chasing each other between the lines, ducking beneath shirts that smacked their heads as they ran. For him, soap was not just cleanliness. It was dignity. It meant he could put on a shirt that smelled of nothing but air and sun, that felt new even when it was patched and worn thin. As the day stretched long, the piles of dirty cloth grew smaller, the lines heavier with clean. Mary's arms trembled with exhaustion, her back bent, but she did not stop. She could not. Laundry day was not a task one abandoned halfway. It was finished only when every shirt, every sheet, every scrap of fabric had been dragged through the frothing cauldron of soap. By evening, the yard had transformed. The tubs were empty, their water black and cold, the soap crocks half spent. The lines swayed gently under their burden, the setting sun painting the wet cloth in shades of gold and crimson. Mary stood still, her hands raw, her eyes tired, but in her chest there was a quiet satisfaction. Soap had done its work. The house would smell cleaner, the beds would feel fresher, the children would crawl into linen that did not carry the stink of labor. It was harsh, it was bitter, but it was life. And as she wiped her hands on her apron, gazing at the soap crock by the door, Mary thought of the next batch, the next boiling, the next season. For as long as the fire burned and the ash fell, there would always be more soap to make, more clothes to wash, more days of battle against the dirt that never stopped coming back. The autumn wind rattled through the bare branches, scattering the last of the leaves across the lane. It was the season for soap again, not the quiet kind, where one family boiled a kettle in their yard, but the louder, larger gathering that pulled neighbors together. Soap making, when done in scale, was not just work, it was almost a festival, a day when labor and fellowship were braided together in the rising smoke of the kettles. The Whitfields came first, trudging up the muddy track with their cart. The barrel in the back sloshed with rendered tallow, covered against the cold with a ragged cloth. Behind them, the Thompsons followed, children clinging to the sides of the wagon, their faces pink from the bite of the air. By mid-morning, the yard was alive with voices, greetings shouted, hands shaken, pots clanged onto stones. The great kettle was set at the center, larger than any one household owned. Its iron sides were patched from years of use, but it held strong, looming like a dark cauldron. Beneath it, the men laid logs in a crisscross stack, kindling tucked in between. One spark, one breath of flame, and the fire leapt to life, crackling eagerly, hungry for the day's long feast of wood. The women gathered the crocks of lye water, each tested and tasted in turn. A feather here, an egg there, the same rituals performed with care, passed down like scripture. There was laughter as one batch proved too strong, hissing against the ground when spilled. But adjustments were made, water added, patience applied. Soap did not bend to haste, it answered only to balance. Children darted between the adults, their boots splashing through puddles, their pockets stuffed with apples from a basket left on the porch. They were shooed away from the kettle, warned again and again about the danger. Yet they circled like moths around a flame, drawn to the mystery of the boiling, to the hiss and spit that made the air seem alive. By midday, the kettle was a living thing, bubbling, growling, froth rising and falling like the breath of some enormous beast. The paddle passed from hand to hand, each person taking their turn, arms trembling, sweat dripping even in the cold air. Stories were told to pass the time, old tales of hard winters, of the year the lye was too weak and the soap came out useless, of neighbors long gone but still remembered in the rhythm of the work. Mary listened as she stirred, her face red from the heat of the fire. Beside her, Sarah hummed a hymn, low and steady, her voice blending with the crackle of wood. The sound soothed the hours, reminding them that though the work was harsh, they were not alone. This was the bond of survival, stronger than blood, forged in fire and fat and ash. When the sun tilted west, the moment came. The mixture thickened, glossy at first, then dull, then heavy, clinging to the paddle like clay. A cheer rose from the group, tired but triumphant. Crocks and barrels were brought forward, lined like soldiers awaiting their rations. Ladles scooped the steaming soap, filling each vessel in turn. The air filled with steam, with the sting of alkali, with the raw smell of change. And then, when the last crock was filled, the fire banked, the kettle scraped clean, the day shifted. Work gave way to fellowship. Bread was broken, stew ladled into bowls, mugs of cider passed hand to hand. The children fell asleep against their mothers' skirts, their faces flushed with warmth. Laughter drifted into the night, carrying with it relief. The soap was made, the season secured, the houses armed once more against the filth of the world. As stars climbed into the dark sky, the kettle cooled, the last embers glowing faintly beneath it. Tomorrow the crocks would be carried home, lined against kitchen walls, stored in cellars. But tonight, the yard was filled with voices and smoke, with stories and song, with the quiet knowledge that together, they had taken ashes and grease and turned them into survival. Soap was never just soap. It was community. The kettle had gone quiet, but the smell lingered. Even after the last ladle had been poured, the sting of lye hung in the air, biting at the nose, clinging to clothes. Mary stood at the doorway, scrubbing her hands with a rag, when a scream split the evening calm. It was young Samuel. He had wandered too close to the barrel where the lye water still dripped, steady and brown into the crock below. In his curiosity, he had leaned over, reaching for the stick they used to stir the ash. His foot slipped in the mud, his hand plunged forward, and a splash leapt up, spattering across his wrist. The scream froze the yard. In an instant, Mary was upon him, hauling him back, her eyes wide with terror. The skin on his wrist was already turning white, as if the flesh itself had been bleached. The boy writhed, the sound raw in his throat, a sound no mother could mistake. "Water!" she cried. Buckets were tipped, hands shaking, cold water poured over the wound. But the lye clung stubbornly, burning, biting. The old women muttered prayers, their voices trembling. Everyone in the valley knew the danger. Lye was not a thing to be trifled with, it scarred, it marked, it reminded. By the firelight, Thomas held his son tight, whispering to calm him as Mary wrapped the wound in cloth soaked with vinegar, the only remedy they knew. Slowly, painfully, The boy's sobs quieted, though his eyes still glistened with pain. The mark would stay, a pale scar circling his wrist like a cruel bracelet. That night, silence fell heavy over the house. The crocks of soap sat cooling, victory soured by fear. Mary sat by Samuel's bed, her hand on his hair, staring into the dark. How many mothers before her had sat the same way, watching a child breathe through the pain of lie? It was a dangerous gift, this craft they practiced. Necessary, yes. But dangerous. The next morning, the neighbors spoke of it as they hauled their soap home. Each had a story: an uncle who lost an eye when lye splashed, a cousin who carried scars across her hands, a neighbor whose batch had boiled over, leaving burns that never healed right. Soap was not gentle, soap demanded a price. Yet none could abandon it. Without it, disease crept in. Without it, clothes rotted, bodies stank, sickness spread. Soap was danger, but it was also defense. Every family bore its scars, and still, every family boiled their kettle when the season came. In the days that followed, Samuel grew quieter, his wrist bandaged, his play slowed. When he looked at the barrel, his eyes filled with a new weariness, a shadow that would never fully leave him. The scar became a lesson etched into his flesh, a warning carried forward into the years. For Mary, too, the lesson hardened. As she scooped soap into smaller crocks, as she rubbed the paste between her palms, she thought not just of cleanliness but of cost. Soap was built from ashes, fat, and fire, but it was also built from pain, from caution, from the thin line between survival and harm. And as winter crept in, the barrels of soap stood like sentinels against the dark. Their presence was comfort, but their making was reminder: nothing in this life came without risk. The first snow came suddenly, sweeping down from the hills like a pale army. By morning, the valley lay hushed in white, the barns roofed in frost, the river a slow ribbon edged with ice. Winter had arrived, and with it, the true test of every household's labor. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of smoke and wool. The windows were fogged from breath and fire, the floors tracked with mud where boots had tramped in from the cold. Soap crocks stood lined against the wall, their brown surfaces hardening with the chill. They looked plain, almost dull, yet in these months they became as precious as food. Illness crept easily in the cold. Coughs lingered, fevers spread, and the smallest wound could fester. Mary knew this too well. She kept her soap near, scooping it into buckets for laundry, dissolving it in tubs of water for scrubbing floors, rubbing it into her own cracked hands. Each time she touched it, the sting reminded her this was their shield. On wash days, the work grew harder. The well water bit like knives, freezing fingers until they bled. Buckets sloshed against skirts, the cold soaking through until bones ached. Still, the clothes had to be washed. Dirt did not vanish in the snow, it hid, waiting. With soap and boiling water, Mary fought it back, leaning over the steaming tub as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. The children, restless and pale, often grew sick from the damp. Samuel coughed through the nights, his scarred wrist tucked under the blankets as if hiding from memory. Mary dabbed his forehead with cloths, whispering prayers, while Thomas tended the fire, the glow the only barrier between warmth and the cold that pressed against the walls. Sometimes, when fever struck hard, the soap was called upon not just for laundry, but for cleansing wounds. Vinegar, herbs, and soap, the three medicines every house knew. Harsh though it was, the brown paste scrubbed filth from cuts, stung away infection, left skin raw but cleaner. Many believed it kept death at bay, and perhaps, in some cases, it did. The neighbors too felt the weight of winter. When storms buried the lanes, families came together, sharing food, wood, even soap. A crock of soap, traded for flour or dried apples, became a bargain struck not in luxury but in survival. There was pride in such exchanges, pride that their labor in the autumn had bought them something to offer now, when the world outside froze. One evening, after a long day of washing, Mary sat by the hearth, the flames painting her face gold. She watched her children sleeping under patched quilts, their cheeks flushed with warmth. The crocks stood in the shadows, silent, their presence heavy with meaning. Each held within it hours of toil, danger, scars, and yet, each was also a promise. Soap was more than soap in winter. It was warmth carried in a different form. It was the smell of clean linen when sickness hovered near. It was the sight of a child's shirt, white against the snow, hanging to dry in the sharp wind. It was a reminder that even in the harshest season, humans could wrest order from filth, safety from waste, hope from ash and grease. And as the snow fell heavy against the windows, muffling the world outside, Mary whispered to herself what her mother had once said: "As long as there is soap, there is a way to fight." By the time the snow melted and the valley's roads softened into mud, whispers had begun to drift through the farms. There was a man in town selling soap. Not crocks of brown paste scraped from kettles, not the jelly that burned hands raw, but neat, pale bars stacked in wooden boxes. He carried them door to door in a cart, each bar wrapped in paper, the name of a maker stamped in bold letters. To some, it seemed a marvel. To others, a threat. Mary first saw him on a market day. His cart stood at the edge of the square, children circling it as if it were a fairground attraction. The air smelled strange around him, sharp, yes, but sweet as well, almost like flowers pressed into fat. Women whispered to one another, eyes darting from the bars to their own cracked hands, remembering the long hours bent over kettles. The seller, a man with a neat beard and polished boots, held up a bar for all to see. "Clean," he declared, his voice carrying. "Gentle. No burns, no scars. Soap, made in town, ready for your home." His words rolled smooth, practiced. He knew the ache of laundry days, the sting of lye, the danger of kettles. He spoke directly to those pains, as if he had lived them himself. Mary stepped closer, Thomas beside her. In the seller's hand, the bar gleamed pale, almost white, its surface smooth as polished stone. He broke a piece, rubbed it between his palms. Foam rose quickly, light and thick, nothing like the thin froth their crocks produced. He held out his hands, clean and unburned. Murmurs rose from the crowd. The price came next. A penny for a bar. 2 for a wrapped pair. For some, it was laughable. They had pennies, yes, but not to spend on what could be made at home. For others, it was temptation itself. A penny for spared arms, spared scars, spared days of boiling. Mary did not buy, not that day. She walked home with her basket of flour and beans, her hands tight on the handle. But the sight of the soap lingered in her mind. That evening, as she scrubbed Samuel's shirt in their own harsh paste, she thought of the seller's pale bar, the way the foam had looked light as clouds. In the weeks that followed, more bars appeared. Neighbors whispered of trying them, of how gentle they felt, how quickly they lathered. One woman claimed her linens came out whiter, another said her children's skin no longer stung. And still, the kettles boiled in most yards, fires lit, lye poured. The old ways held fast, but now there was a choice, and choices changed everything. Thomas frowned when Mary mentioned the cellar again. What happens when he stops coming? When the road floods, or the wars take the trade? What then? Will we forget how to make what we need? His voice was firm, and she said no more. But in her chest, the thought grew, perhaps her daughter's arms need not ache as hers did. Perhaps the scars of lye could be a memory, not a legacy. That spring, in kitchens across the valley, two worlds stood side by side. The old crocks, brown and biting, born of ash and fat. And the new bars, pale and neat, brought from town in carts. For the first time in memory, soap was not just survival. It was choice. Spring ripened into summer, and with it came change. The river thawed, fields turned green, and wagons rumbled more often along the dirt roads. With every market day, the soap seller returned, his cart fuller, his voice louder. And with every return, more households began to drift toward his pale bars, their neat shape a promise of ease. At first, it was the wealthier families who bought. Those who had pennies to spare, those who wanted their linens whiter, their hands unscarred. They spoke proudly of the soap as if it were a mark of standing. At church, their children's collars seemed brighter, their wives' hands smoother. It was noticed, whispered about. But pride was a sharp blade. In the valley, pride and labor ran deep, pride in ash barrels lined along the yard, in kettles blackened with soot, in scars carried like proof of endurance. To abandon the kettle felt, to some, like weakness. It was a betrayal of mothers and grandmothers who had bent their backs over boiling pots so their families could survive. Neighbors began to watch each other more closely. If one carried home a bar wrapped in stamped paper, the others noticed. Some frowned. Some envied. At gatherings, the talk shifted. Her linens look whiter, one woman muttered, eyes narrowing. But what does she know of soap making now? Will her daughter learn? Or will she grow soft, waiting for the cart to come? Mary stood between these worlds. She still stirred her kettle, still poured lye with careful hands, the memory of Samuel's scar always near. Yet each time she scrubbed a shirt raw against the board, she thought of the pale bar in the seller's hand, the way it lathered quick and easy. She thought of her daughter, Eliza, small now but growing fast, and wondered what future she would inherit. Thomas held firm to tradition. If you cannot make it yourself, you do not truly own it, he said one evening, stacking wood by the door. A bar from town is no different than a chain around your wrist. What happens when the cart breaks down, or the price doubles, or war stops it all? What happens then? His words were heavy, carved from years of labor. Yet even Thomas noticed the whispers, the sideways looks. When neighbors spoke of ease, of soap that did not bite their skin, there was a flicker in his eyes, not agreement, but unease. The world was changing, and change always carried weight. By midsummer, the valley was divided. Some households clung fiercely to their kettles, their yards thick with the smell of ash and fat. Others lined up eagerly when the cart arrived, coins pressed into palms, bars carried home like treasure. Between them grew a quiet tension, an unspoken judgment. Who was wiser? Who was weaker? Who was preparing for the future, and who was clinging to the past? One evening, Mary walked past the Whitfields' yard. Their kettle sat unused, weeds growing around its stones. By the door, a neat stack of pail bars gleamed in the fading light. She paused, staring, her own hands cracked from the week's laundry, her back aching. For a moment, she imagined leaving her kettle cold, her ash barrel empty, her hands unscarred. For a moment, she imagined ease. But only for a moment. Then she walked on, the weight of tradition pressing her shoulders. Soap was never just soap. It was memory, labor, pride. And pride did not yield easily, not even to comfort. By the 1840s, the Valley's children were growing up in a world split in two. Some still knew the sting of lye on their skin, the smoke of kettles in their hair. Others had never stirred a paddle, never scraped soap from the sides of a crock. For them, soap came neat and wrapped, carried home from town in a pocket or basket. In Mary's home, both worlds collided. Samuel, older now, carried his scar like a badge. He remembered the scream, the vinegar-soaked cloth, the way the lye burned into him. When he looked at the barrel in the yard, he kept his distance, his respect mixed with fear. His sister Eliza, younger, saw the same barrel as a relic. She had watched the soap seller at the market, had touched the smooth pail bars in a neighbor's house, and in her eyes the kettle seemed heavy, old, unnecessary. At gatherings, the differences showed. Children from soap-buying homes carried shirts that gleamed white, collars stiff, their hands softer. Children from soap-making homes bore the faint smell of smoke and fat, their clothes coarser, their fingers rough. It was not spoken aloud, but in the way they looked at each other, in the silence between words, the divide deepened. Mary noticed it most on laundry days. Eliza complained of the sting in her hands, the ache in her back as she scrubbed shirts in the tub. "Why must we keep doing this?" she asked once, her voice sharp with youth. "Why not just buy? The Whitfields don't boil anymore. Their soap is white as snow." Thomas, stacking wood nearby, turned at once. "Because the day you forget how to make something, you begin to lose yourself. If the cart stops coming, what then? Will you wait for strangers to bring you what you need? No. You'll boil. You'll stir. You'll survive. That's the way." Eliza said no more, but in her silence there was defiance. She lived in a time when choices had appeared, when survival no longer seemed chained to kettles and scars. And in her heart, though she never said it aloud, she dreamed of a future without the stink of fat or the burn of lye. The elders muttered too. At church, old Mrs. Whitfield shook her head when she saw young women with smooth hands, girls who would never know the ritual of boiling. "They're forgetting," she whispered. "Forgetting the labor that kept them alive." Yet even she carried a bar in her basket now, its neat shape hidden under a cloth. By late summer, the valley had changed. Smoke no longer rose from every yard. Some kettles lay rusting, their stones toppled, vines creeping across them. Others still burned, stubborn against time, flames licking at iron, paddles stirring heavy foam. Two traditions stood side by side, one rooted in ashes, the other wrapped in paper. And the children, caught between them, carried the choice into the future. Some bore scars they would never forget. Others carried only the memory of pale bars passed from hand to hand. But all of them, in ways they did not yet see, were shaping the next chapter. For soap was never just soap. It was inheritance. By the late 1800s, the sound of kettles bubbling in farmyards grew rarer. Where once every autumn was marked by the smell of smoke and fat, now the air was quieter, cleaner, filled instead with the creak of wagons carrying goods from town. Soap, pale and wrapped, was no longer a curiosity. It was everywhere. The seller's cart had given way to shops, small stores with shelves stacked in neat rows, each bar bearing names that grew familiar: Colgate, Pears, Procter & Gamble. Soap was no longer made in secret yards with barrels dripping lye. It was made in factories, in brick buildings that loomed above riverbanks, their chimneys pouring smoke into the sky. In homes like Mary's, the shift was slow, but it came. The barrel by the wall rotted away, its staves falling one by one into the dirt. The great kettle, blackened by decades of fire, stood unused, weeds curling around its stones. At first, it felt like betrayal to leave them idle. But as the years passed, and as bars of soap became cheaper, more reliable, more gentle, the old ways slipped into silence. Mary herself grew gray, her hands lined from years of stirring, her back bent from laundry days. She still remembered Samuel's scream, the white scar on his wrist, the vinegar cloth pressed to his skin. She remembered her own mother's voice, telling her to pack the ashes tight, to stir the pot slow, to test the lye with an egg. But she also watched her daughter Eliza scrub clothes with a pale bar that lathered quick and soft, her hands unscarred, her face unstrained. And in that sight, there was peace. The neighbors too changed. Where once there had been pride in kettles and scars, now there was pride in bright linens, in ease, in time saved. Some old men grumbled that the world was growing soft, that children would never learn the hardness that had built survival. Yet even they used the factory soap, slipping bars into their pockets after market day, their protests fading with the years. By the final decades of the century, the memory of ash barrels and lye hoppers lived only in stories. Grandmothers told children of the days when soap was born of fire and danger, when a careless slip could burn the flesh, when survival was measured in crocks of brown paste. The children listened, wide-eyed, but to them it sounded like another world, as distant as fairy tales. And yet, the old kettles never fully vanished. Some lay rusting in farmyards, half buried in weeds, relics of a craft that had once meant life. Others were passed down, kept as curiosities, reminders of a time when nothing was wasted, when survival was wrestled from ashes and grease. They stood silent, but they carried memory. For though the world had changed, one truth lingered: every pale bar stacked in shops, every neat wrapper stamped with a company's name, carried within it the echo of those early kettles, of the hands that stirred, of the scars that burned, of the mothers who turned waste into survival. Soap was no longer made at home, but its story remained, woven into the fabric of the 1800s, into the lives of those who had bent their backs and risked their flesh, into the quiet legacy of labor that still clung, faint as smoke, to every bar. And as the century ended, the world stepped forward, leaving the kettles behind. But the memory of their fire, their danger, their gift, would never fade.